What's up, fellas? Ivy here. Welcome to a new episode of Production Diaries podcast, where I'm showing you real examples of song production from start to finish. What you're about to see today is metal mix for ReWOLFers, metal band from St. Petersburg, Russia. Started as a simple request of mixing a song using 5-finger death punch as a reference, it turned out to be pretty unique mix. In my honest opinion, it's my best work so far. This time guys from the band allowed me to demonstrate the song in its full, but still I'd wanted to invite you to visit their Bandcamp page and get the single. This way you'll have pure experience without lack of quality caused by recording and format conversions. All the links will be in the description. And just before we start, I'd wanted to thank all the viewers for great feedback on previous episode, as well as all the supporters on Patreon. Running this channel wouldn't be possible without your help. Let's start from quick song overview. At this point I need to see if tracking quality is good or not. I already applied some panning for drums in order to have proper picture, so let's check it all out and then I'll share my thoughts. Alright, so tone and timing of both bass and guitars are all good. The only thing I've noticed is tonal difference between first and other parts of clean guitar track. Probably caused by using different pickup. This issue will be fixed later. Toms contain huge amount of low resonating bleed. It may be a problem, so we might want to edit unwanted parts out or do the level automation to bring it down. This channel right here got pretty weird name. Obviously you can point the mic to all 4 cymbals at the same time, so when I tried to figure out its direction in stereo I've noticed one thing. There are actually 2 hi-hats in the kit. Check this out. Other cymbals mentioned in the name seem to be too quiet, so this track will probably be like direct mic of second hat.
Сделай шаг и не... Мой ответ готов! Жить, но без оков! Без оков! Как изо льда твои слова летят в меня. Сделай шаг и не тень, не моя тень. Прячу мысли от льда. Твои слова сквозь терни всех преград. Я не жалкий раб. В клочья порви меня слабого. Сбрось со скалы ликующей радостью. Твои слова.
Vocal doubles seem to have minor mistakes like different lengths of some lines here and there.
Сделай шаг и не робей, если на...
Not something to be worried about, as I'm gonna edit everything anyways, so it will be fixed. Next step is to analyze our reference and extract as much useful information as possible. As you can see, I went through the entire album and collected isolated parts of different elements in order to use it for tone replication. File names include both title of the song and contents information. I won't demonstrate it all for copyright reasons, but you're free to search for them if you wish. There are quite a lot. The tricky part was extracting the bass, and that's the only thing I'll demonstrate. Please keep in mind that this short playback is for educational purposes. My point is to demonstrate the process of getting isolated part, so I'll use shit ton of effects over it for obvious reasons. The song called Meet My Maker contains 2 interesting parts. This one taken from the beginning contains isolated rhythm guitar. And this part taken from around 2 minutes and 15 seconds contains rhythm guitars, bass and tail of lead guitar. The thing is, both parts use exact same guitar take, so if we synchronize them with enough precision and flip the phase of one track, guitars will be cancelled out, leaving us with bass and lead guitar tail. Obviously we need isolated bass tone for matching, so how do we get rid of that lead guitar tail? Actually we don't have to, it's pretty much one long note, so I copied it over and over, lowering the volume each time. With that we simulate original continuous fading out. And now if we want to match the bass, we simply need to capture the spectrum of this dirty part, then place our own bass parts where pink regions are, put simulated tail on top and do second spectrum capture. When we match one signal to another, we basically measure spectral difference between both. So even if both have same stable noise over them, in our case it's lead tail, it won't count as a difference. Matching equalization then should be applied to replicated bass, giving us dope results, so we only need to play around reamping settings and see how close can we get. Usually it's not hard. What actually is hard though is replication of drums, so I decided to start from it. Kick and snare of this album sounds like triggers. Probably not fully replaced, but definitely there was a lot of triggering because it's just too tight and linear, especially the snare. So my plan was to get as close as possible with replicated triggers, and then sum them up with real tracking we've got. Let's start from kick trigger. Obviously I've had to capture the hits first. All done by hands, because I don't trust easy automatic solutions. Usually there will be offsets, so doing it manually gives better results. I didn't feel like making completely new trigger, so I decided to use the one from Metal Mixing Guide number 10. It's tight, short and linear, and that's exactly what I want, so I only needed to match the tone. Basically I got rid of everything except for 2 trigger channels and bus related to them. Check this out. Right off the bat I attempted to match the spectrum on top of old processing. I used isolated kicks from the beginning of This Is My War as a reference. And correction of annoying 2 kHz right after. Sounds cool, right? Still the trigger sounds little too short, so I used another layer with default preset of Metal Foundry to fix it. All the mix are turned on, though I got rid of all the other elements in order to save the RAM. Signal is squashed by a CLA76 with Rock My Room preset. And then I used EQ to cut out all the unnecessary crap so it remains transparent. This new layer and KD bus now routed to kick trig bus, which I used to glue the triggers together and give it some additional balls. Chain starts from light saturation of NLS bus. I used to bring down incoming sensitivity so it won't clip. Next thing, our bass exciter, which helps to get more focus and power on lows. Then I used 2 compressors to get fat sounding. First one is single band SSL with about 4 decibels of gain reduction. And then multi-band compressor from Isotope, where I used much more extreme settings together with gain compensation, so we won't mess up original spectrum balance. And then I used Pro L to get control on peaks. So trigger was done and I wanted to see how it works together with the main kick. Right off the bat I used CLA 76 with kick preset. Resulting tone sounds like there is too much lows, plus I can hear some annoying mid-range ring, so I fixed it with EQ in front of compressor, providing cleaner spectrum and better response of CLA. However, there still was some mid-range ringing, so this time I cut it out after CLA to make sure that compressor won't pull it back. Last thing I wanted to do is to get rid of the bleed, so resulting some remains tight. I didn't want to use regular gate, just because source signal is pretty dynamic, so we could get missed hits or lack of gating. Luckily we've got short attack layer of trigger, so I used it as a side chain driver for gate. Same thing on sub-kick channel. Helps to keep the sub-bass region nice and tight. I think it sounds good enough, so we can print the results. I did it in batch mode from kick trigger bus and both processed live kicks to have more options in the mix. Pretty much the same story goes for snare. In this case I decided to try snare tone from Metal Mixing Guide number 25. Originally it was drums template, but I got rid of some channels like toms, kicks and some others that we don't really need. In this case so-called drums bus will be our final point of processing. So that's how it sounded right off the bat. Immediately I attempted to match the timbre using snare hit from the intro of This Is My War. Pretty cool, right? Second step was subtle correction of dynamics with Saturn, which helped to make everything little more focused and tight, especially 100 to 300 Hz region. Check this out. Everything above 300 Hz remains the same. My next move was little cut on resonating mid-range of snare bulb. You can clearly hear this annoying ring on lower velocity levels. think I also decreased the length of top mic in the internal mixer. At first I didn't plan to use ambience mix. Thanks to my curiosity, I tried to use those too, and come up with slightly fuller tone. Basically what I did is held ton of spectrum cuts so nothing jumps out. And I also used slight enhancement of dynamics. My last adjustment was this late room channel, where I used Black Beauty 6.5 with direct channels turned off. So purpose is obvious, I wanted some of that short ambience. And so I did process it with limiter, about 10 decibels of gain reduction to get slightly destroyed sounding. Cleaning EQ, which integrates the timbre into the overall sum. And that's it. I was happy with the tone, so I spent next hour or two capturing hits and programming velocity of every channel, so everything sounds more or less natural. And where it was done, I printed the audio of our trigger from drums bus in single channel mode. We now have good foundation to start working on drums. As you can see, I already imported all the files to this new project. Getting powerful kick as a foundation for future mix seemed to be good starting point. So first of all I did little balancing of channels to get more natural sounding, plus 4 decibels boost of audio on live tracks. Both pre-processed kicks together with trigger then go to kick bus, so at this point I'm working on the tone of the entire sum. First of all I use some EQ to get rid of problematic parts of spectrum. About 3 decibels of compression with CLA 76. This way we'll get slight attenuation of double kick parts, while single hits become tight and more focused. Additional tone correction after CLA gives us more stable tone fix as it won't change compressor's response. Reverb in front of the chain helps to make the sound more open and natural. At this point I've noticed some more unpleasant mid-range resonances from live kicks, So I went back to the main one and applied some more EQ. Sounds dope, so let's move on to snare drum. Before any attempts on mixing the overall snare sum, I've noticed one thing. Average peak level of trigger is extremely close to 0 decibels, pretty much the same as our kick drum, but still it sounds quiet. That means that we've got extremely loud transients, in other words, lack of RMS. We need about 13 decibels boost to get proper volume, and if I do just that, we'll end up with extreme peak level difference between kick and snare. This, in turn, would give us unnecessary pumping when it comes to master compression. So better solution is to use limiter to raise the level and cut off outstanding peaks at the same time. Such a great compression seemed to create lack of power, and I fixed that with boost of lows using our bass exciter. What I've started to notice now is weird noisy tail of snare. So I use Saturn's dynamics controller to reduce sustain of higher bands. Sounds sick. Let's now integrate the live snare. Obviously it's too ringy and raw, so first of all I used EQ to reduce mid-range resonances on top mic. Let's also make it little hotter with drive of NLS channel. Both mics are routed to snare kit bus. Name stands for some of live recorded channels. Now we can use the EQ to fix the timbre of live snare to get good correlation with trigger. Slight limiting to get stable peaks. Both both lip snare and trigger face each other on snare full bus, and the only thing I did there was this little cut around 1 kHz, as I wasn't sure if it's coming from trigger or live snare. It's time to add the cymbals. What we've got our main overhead mix, 2 mix for different hi-hats and mono room. I pretty much started from applying radical panning for overhead channels, and routed them to main overhead's bus to process. First thing I've noticed was weird balance of elements. It seems like there is not enough cymbals and too much of bleed from snare and toms. So first of all I used multibin compressor in order to reduce the attack of snare drum, sort of make it more squashed. Second step is Saturn in multibin mode. Here I use dynamics controller to increase sustain of cymbals, making them loud and rich. So now it's time to form proper tone and free some space for other elements of our mix. I didn't want complete match of reference, so all the correction was done by ear, leaving us with crispy and scooped sounding. Additional touch on snare resonances. Now let's move to the hi-hats. Because of the fact that we have 2 of them, one placed on the left and one on the right, I decided to thread both as second pair of overheads. Stereo image of main overhead channel helped me to figure out proper panning, and then I used inverted settings to get some nice spread of stereo image. Whatever belongs to the right side of overheads will now have strong support from the left side, so it's harder to point the exact location of particular cymbal, like it's everywhere at the same time. Pretty cool thing. What I did next was reduction of outstanding frequencies on these secondary channels, so it sounds transparent when summed with main overheads. I also did low-pass filtering as I was happy with the amount of highs of main overheads. No need to create extra mess there. both hats, then go to secondary overheads bus, where I used same Saturn settings as on main overheads for pretty much the same purpose. And then I've noticed this nasty ring around 500 Hz. At this point I went back to right overhead to do slight reduction of highs. I wanted to smooth up the high-end presence of second hat. And then I routed both main and secondary overheads buses to this very main overheads bus. After some rest I went back to the mix and heard some noises around 4 and 5 kHz. Overhead sounds good now, and we only need to add the room. So first thing I used was CLA 76 with Rock My Room preset to get that heavy and colorful compression. And then I used equalizers to fix the spectrum in order to integrate the room to our overheads. Room may seem little loud with EQs turned off, all because I used higher level on channels fader afterwards. Last part of drum mix is toms. Oh man, it was a struggle. I tried all kind of things, but ended up with complete mess every time. Lucky attempts of getting good sounding of the actual hits gave me extremely loud, dirty and boomy bleed. Other cases when bleed was good and natural led me straight to weak sounding of toms themselves. I couldn't just cut off the bleed either, because in this case I ended up with lack of low end sustain, so I used technique mentioned in previous episode of Production Diaries. You basically edit out all the bleed using crossfades, in order to get sudden, but still more or less acceptable fade outs, ending up with, let's call it, useful signal. Then you cancel this useful signal out of unedited source track. As a result, we now have both useful hits and separated bleed. With such a signal you can do all kind of weird stuff with toms until you're happy with sounding. Use tons of compression, almost any kind of EQ, it won't be a problem because you only apply it to useful signal. Let me show you what I'm talking about in context of good processing model applied to unedited source files. C. Tom sounds great, but total amount of bleed creates absolute mess. Anyways, let me show you the way I processed all this stuff, starting from working on separated hits. So I applied proper panning and started from second rack tom. First of all, I used NLS with maximum drive, some saturation and brightness to start with. Second thing is basic attempt to form better tone, making it bright and heavier. Then I wanted to emphasize transients. SPL Transient Designer is used for this purpose. I also thought it will be good idea to reduce the sustain just a bit, so I did that as well. And last thing was limiter to gain some RMS. Then I copied this chain to other channels and routed them to Tom's bus to process. First thing I wanted to do is to get some control on dynamics, so I used default settings of Isotope's multiband compressor, fine-tuning the threshold so there is about 3 or 4 decibels of reduction on each band. Higher one remains untouched, and I also used 5 decibels boost for third band to let toms cut through the mix better. Still it sounded kinda weak, so I thought of adding some heavy low end. For that purpose I went back and used our bass exciter with pretty extreme boost of lows on every channel. This plugin is clipping sensitive, so I used gain staging to give it more headroom for proper work. Minus 12 decibels in front of the plugin and plus 12 after. Much better. Next thing I did was using EQ after compressor to fine-tune the amount of compressed low end, and also clean up the mid-range. So I was more or less happy with how it sounded and decided to close the chain with compression of peaks. For that purpose I used combination of NLS saturation and limiter. Even though I keep drive at 0, NLS still acts as some sort of clipper, cutting off most of the peaks so limiter won't have to do much work. In other words, we do this mostly with distortion instead of compression, which gives more transparent results. And now we can finally bring our bleed back, use same panning settings for each channel and route them tracks to a separate bus. Before we'll go for integration, let me show you what we've achieved using such treatment comparing to source state of audio. See, not only we got light and clean bleed, which now can be changed in any way we want, it seems like hits themselves started to sound more articulated and clean, because we don't feed our chains with that nasty low-end mess anymore. So let's get back to the integration. At first I tried to clean up the spectrum so bleed sits better in the mix together with overheads. I did that using this EQ on the bus. Then scanned each channel for low-end resonances and reduced them, as well as one or two other things I didn't like. So it sounded okay, but I've noticed that it kinda messed up the balance of cymbals because of appeared high end. Not a big thing, but I changed my mind anyways and cut that stuff off with low pass filter, still providing clean and uncompressed low end sustain for isolated toms. At this point I took few hours off to refresh my ability to hear things, and when I returned to the mix I figured that toms still sounds kinda muddy on lows. We've still had a lot of compressed resonating bleed coming from overheads in room which sounded kinda boxy. I couldn't fix that with surgical EQ as it would also change the bleed of other elements, so I did put multi-bin compressors that can work inside chain mode on main and secondary overheads buses. They will receive control signal from isolated toms, working mostly on low or mid-range where all the boxiness comes from, at the same time reducing the lows so resonating low-end bleed won't stack up with lows of the actual toms. So overhead sounds cleaner, but it still felt like toms are a little muddy, so I used additional EQ on tom's bus to do final polishing. and then reduce the stereo width. Random experiment with the sound, but I've noticed that it made the toms more organic and natural in context of the entire mix. And that's it for drums. At this point I knew that I'm gonna work on reamping in separate project, so we won't create unnecessary load on hardware. I did export of a drum track from master bus, which is basically the output for all the channels or buses marked with them. I didn't review the processing since the start, because as I said it's pretty transparent. NLS bus for some gluing and saturation. In order to avoid clipping on this module I used to attenuate incoming sensitivity of a bus. At first it was -6 decibels, which I compensated with Next EQ, where I also did some basic high-pass filtering for the side of stereo, but as I continued to build up the mix, I used to attenuate signal in front of NLS even more, ending up with -12 decibels, just enough to keep NLS safe from overloads. And finally I used limiter, fine-tuning the loudness according to reference after I was done with the mix. Now it's time to do reference reamping. It's pretty easy since we've got perfectly isolated references for analysis, so it's only matter of using proper amplification and then matching the tones with isotope EQ. I pretty much started with bass. So first thing I did was bass amp room to get some nice basic tone to work with. Default settings sounded too muddy so I lowered the bass and maxed out mids and highs. Also brought some of that DI signal in. Still it was kinda dark, so I used a 47 distortion pedal in front of the amp to make it really bright and aggressive. And then I matched the tone using isolated reference as a target and some fragment from our bass track as a source. Obviously notes from the source fragment should contain same notes as a reference, otherwise matching will be inaccurate. And that's how it started to sound now. I also used additional reduction of 200 Hz as I felt that there is little too much. Then I used multi-bin compressor. We only compress lows and mids, leaving highs untouched, so this module should make dynamics of affected bands more linear. I used automatic gain option to compensate for level drops caused by processing, so we won't mess up the spectrum, only make those lows and mids full and stable. And finally I used limiter to gain RMS and keep peaks under control. Speaking of guitar tones, I didn't bother with going in details with amp settings and used ReWOLFer with preset from Metal Mixing Guide number 27, which is the tone of Red Before Black album by Cannibal Corpse. And then I matched the tone pretty much the same way we did on bass. I don't like having multiple matching EQs in the same project, because in my case it has a tendency to reverse the settings, so I use deconvolver to save correction curve in a form of impulse response. I applied same settings for all rhythm channels, pan first double 80% left and second double 80% to the right. All of them are going to a bus, where I use multi-bin compressor with automatic gain compensation and pretty high amounts of compression in order to really glue tracks together, making the entire sum full and stable. I also use subtle major for everything except for lower band to match the stereo width according to our reference. And final limiter to have peaks under control. I only realized it when filmed all this stuff, but it doesn't do anything. All because I did recalculation of levels and gain staging for the purpose of video simplification, so even though level outcome is the same, incoming signal should be 3 decibels higher, so originally it did some transparent limiting, not a big thing though. Speaking of a lead track, I pretty much used the same settings with different set of pedals. Instead of using overdrive, I put on compressor together with some chorus and slight mixture of low-tuned octaver. This track is routed to rhythm guitars bus 2, because I wanted to get same density from compressor and limiter. Later I'm gonna do 2 pass export from that bus. One for rhythm guitars and one for lead. There's no need to sum everything to one track. And last thing we have is clean guitar. As I already mentioned, we've had tone difference between takes, so I used matching EQ to correct the tone of first part using other parts as a reference. With that, entire thing sounds more or less consistent. Honestly, I wasn't quite in the mood to experiment with custom clean tones. Instead, I decided to try rhythm guitar processing chain to at least get something that I can fix in the mix, because as we all know, it's always possible. We've all been in a situations when you just finish recording of smooth jazz tune for piano, but occasionally ended up with 7 million songs 2 minutes long grindcore album with 5 distortion pedals and 7 Seth Putnams on every channel including drums, and you also forgot to hit record button. Unfortunately, you can't pay for studio time to re-record everything, because you already spent all the label money on drugs and toes. But don't worry fam, I got some life hacks for you. Just ask your mixing engineer to fix it in a mix. He'll be happy to do that. If he'll be asking you how it's even possible, just tell him that wiring was all bad and stuff. It's a common issue, so he'll understand. Even if for some weird reason he can do that, mastering engineer will save the day. He probably got some isotope ozone presets for piano. That's gonna be the shit. Literally. Subscribe to my channel and leave a comment if that ever happened to you. Jokes aside, I started with same set, but did put down incoming level of audio together with getting rid of overdrive pedal so more details can be heard. In addition, I did some EQ before the amp to control the way it responds. Reduction of sublows together with few cuts allowed the amp to be more transparent. So we've got some sort of dirty overdriven sound on the output. Not good at all, but I'll give it additional touches later. And so when I was done with processing, I did 3-pass editing. First of all, I did manual editing of all tracks so timing matches the grid. Then I've noticed that drums sometimes have pretty obvious offsets too. I didn't want to edit them because it could lead to obvious sonic artifacts that won't be hidden by distortion. So instead I did second pass editing to match everything to drums. For rhythm guitars was grouped together so we thread them as a whole and won't use synchronization between tracks. And then I just moved warping points of other guitars, which at this point still existed, so technically I only did 1 pass of warp editing for them. And lastly I got rid of some unwanted noises on parts that's supposed to be silent, like this section right here. After that I did batch export of bass, clean and rhythm guitars, additionally exporting soloed lead in a second pass as it was routed to a same bus as rhythm. As mentioned previously, I wanted to give additional touch on clean track we've got. I know it's not clean at all but whatever. At this point I felt that it sounds boring and dirty. So I wanted to clean up all the mess and bring some nice space processing in. It was just experiment, so I used separate project to work on the stem. This way we can avoid unnecessary load on CPU. I pretty much started with removing those thunder-like lows together with some mid-range. Then I used multi-bin compressor with gain compensation to raise the overall density of guitar so it can be more stable in the mix. And then I used short stereo delay with no feedback, pretty much widening things up. Some more delay on top for space. Some NLS drive for colors. And now I started to clean up the spectrum on mids with more details. I used 3 decibels boost of output to compensate for gain losses, and that lifted up some problem frequencies on higher mid-range, but at this point I wasn't aware of it as my ears were focused on lower parts of the spectrum. Anyways, right after the EQ I used enhancer to get wider stereo. Still, I didn't choose the reverb, so here it is. Just a small addition to the space image. At this point I've finally noticed some nasty whistling on higher mid-range. There wasn't any more free space for plugins, so I used to route the track to a bus, where I could use the EQ. And now it's all good except for one little problem. I did lock up the space processing inside of the chain, and that could be a problem as I'm not sure how much of it will we need in context of the entire mix. In other words, I need the ability to control the amount of space by separating the audio to dry signal and space part. Moving space-related plugins to separate FX channels doesn't seem to be a good idea as it would ruin relationships between modules, when every other plugin affects work of the previous one and vice versa. So I used good old trick with phase cancellation to fix the problem. First of all, we must export the entire track, fully processed. And for second export I turn off everything related to space. So what we've got are full and dry stems, and if we flip the phase of any of them, dry parts of the tone will cancel each other out, leaving us with completely wet space signal. Of course there gonna be some artifacts as we use NLS in between of modules, but whatever man. We now have separated dry and wet stems. Pretty cool, right? With that we're ready to return to our drums mix and bring other elements in. As you can see, all stems are already here, routed straight to master bus, and it sound like this. Even though we've used commercial references to craft the tones, it seems like they aren't quite fit our drums mix. That's what we should fix. Of course it's not a good idea to work on everything at the same time, so we'll work on bass first as it will provide us with fuller context when it comes to guitar's integration. Right now I feel like it sounds kinda boxy and dark. At the same time we seem to have problems with dynamics. Compared to drum track, bass doesn't feel dense enough, and in order to battle the issue I use NLS and multibin compressor. NLS works in mic mode, providing us with nice saturation focused on low end, and compressor pretty much makes first 3 bands much more linear. I use gain compensation mode, so we only work on dynamics without changing the spectrum balance. With next EQ I got rid of those nasty mid-range zones and made the tone brighter to let it cut through the mix. In addition I used 2 EQs with only one surgical cut of mids on each as I wanted to be able to bypass them from mixer. This way I could quickly check if chosen frequencies are correct. Then I use some limiting so bass remains even more stable in the mix. And finally I applied sidechain compression driven by kick and snare to get nice flow between bass and drums. So now it sounds great, except for one section of a song where rhythm guitars are fading out. It sounds way too heavy and dry, sucking out the attention from clean guitars. So I decided to bring some contrast to a song and use different processing for this section. First of all I went back to Reamping project and did second export of bass, only this time I used unedited source file to avoid deformation artifacts, which could be noticed as we won't have rhythm guitars hiding that stuff. I also used lower drive and output gain on distortion pedal so it sounds cleaner. And before we'll go for processing, just let me say that we have automated level in order to get proper transition between different bass tones. I don't want to touch it, so everything may sound a little too loud outside of full processing context. Just keep that in mind. First of all I got rid of that heavy mid-range to make the bass more transparent. Second, CLA 76 with slow release and extreme amount of compression to get continuous and stable sustain of those long notes. Then I used echo together with two different reverbs to get really musical and colorful space. Some notes seem to have that nasty ring on mid-range. So I got rid of it using this EQ in front of reverbs so it won't be amplified by them. After that I did correction of side part of the stereo, which moves low end focus to center and also expands them mids just a bit to get more colors. Lastly, I used multiband compressor to set the limit of sonic pressure for lows and mids, so it takes proper place in the mix. We're done. Let's listen to those transitions now. Sounds dope to me. And now we can finally work on guitars. Let's start from rhythm. Main problem with it is lack of transparency, so right off the bat I used EQ to fix the timbre. I got rid of all the unnecessary low end which seemed to conflict with bass, also tamed that obvious ring around 700 Hz and brought up some 10 kHz for brightness. Then I used mid-side EQ to adjust the stereo field. When I checked the mix in mono I've noticed that some parts of spectrum seem to conflict with bass, and so those was reduced with mid-bands. So when I did full stereo audition, I figured that reduction of 300 Hz bump have made same zone of side little more obvious, so I did 50% reduction around the same zone of side, partly getting rid of that weird stereo shift. Additionally, I did little boost on lows as it seemed to fill subtle low and emptiness of side. Pretty much the same way I use sidechain compression from kick and snare, only this time it's only applied to center of stereo. There is nothing but guitars on side, so we keep it unprocessed and transparent, still cleaning up the road for drums in the center. And last thing I did was automation of stereo image for this part of the song. The thing is, I wanted very smooth and transparent fade out, so guitars kind of disappear in the mix at some point. Still, I didn't like how linear that fade out was, so at the same time I also slowly decreased the stereo width, making transition nice and smooth. And that was it for rhythm guitars. Now we can add the lead track. I didn't want to polish the tone right off the bat, because I knew that I'm gonna use a lot of space processing, which can change the spectrum in some way. So first of all I did light correction of timbre same way as on rhythm guitars, and then applied Uber mod, enhancing the stereo with modulation just a bit. And then I use pair of delay and reverb, additionally expanding side of the stereo where all that space remains, allowing for more organic spread of lead track in the mix. And only then I did polishing equalization to get rid of all those whistles, at the same time boosting useful highs and mids so lead track cuts through the mix. When that was done, I went back to rhythm guitars and applied region automation in such a way that level drops by 1 decibel when rhythm faces lead or clean guitars, so they can be heard better. Additionally, I decided to give some space to rhythm guitars, so I pretty much copied the main channel, only this time I didn't use anything but Valhalla Room. Pretty subtle adjustment to overall picture though. I summed both rhythm guitar and reverb layer under a bus as I didn't plan to further manipulate the balance between those. Now we can finally go for our pre-processed clean guitars. It sounded pretty good outside of mix context, but now it feels like a little too dirty and weak on lows, so I used some EQ to get rid of high-end harshness, and after that, our bass exciter to get more of that bottom. I also tried to play around with equalization of wet stem, ending up with pretty big reduction of 2 zones of side. I just felt that this way the overall sum seemed to get pretty nice focus and better transparency in the mix. And after that was done, I just did region automation to fine-tune the balance between wet and dry parts according to the context. So mix was done and I wanted to see if I can do it better with some adjustments on master, because at this point it didn't do much really. So I did some comparisons with reference and realized that our track is way too dynamic, punchy and aggressive, especially kick and snare. So instead of sounding like 5-fingered death punch, we ended up with 7 front kicks to the balls, and that's not okay if you ask me. And so I used multi-bin compressor in attempts to battle the issue. In this case I used automatic gain compensation as it allows to minimize spectrum changes caused by compression. And for every next band I did use less and less of attack time, because the lower you go, the longer transients you have. And that sounded much closer. On top of that I tried pretty generic multi-band stereo enhancement, where every higher band have bigger stereo expansion. And again mix became better. Last thing I did was partial matching of spectrum of our mix to the reference. Full amount sounded ridiculous, as there is big difference in arrangements, so I found good amount of effect when it sounded better and still more or less transparent. And so I thought it's ready to face the vocals. However, before we proceed, I'd wanted to simplify this session by reprinting process stems to use them in master project. This way we'll unload the CPU and get rid of all that plugin mess in case if we'll need to do some adjustments. And so I did batch export from channels and buses routed to master. Now it's time to go for vocals, but before we'll start, I'd wanted to make little spoilers so you'll get the idea of chosen algorithm. The main problem was multi-bin compressor we've put on master. It was set according to dynamics of instrumental mix, so it didn't have any more headroom to be loaded with vocals. When I tried to adjust the vocals to proper level, instrumental part became overcompressed. I didn't want to suffer compromises, so instead I'm going to mix vocals on top of instrumental. It will bypass master chain, summing with instrumental right in front of limiter. This method, however, has its own flaws, like loss of dynamic relations between mix and vocals, so we'll have to simulate that with complex sidechain compression and precise tone integration. I'm going to do this in 3 steps. First one is what you're about to see right now. We will do basic preparation of tracks so they can face the mix in slightly better and stable state. All of them are processed in the same way. The only difference is that I group doubles under a bus so they can be exported as a whole thing, plus I did minor panning off center. However, single tracks don't need that routing and panning, so I use separate channel for them. There was no reason to create new channels for each pack, so I just put them one by one on timeline. Of course, I'm not going to export the entire thing as it is. Later I'll use audio events as a target for export using locators to selection command key. So what I did on this stage is pretty generic stuff. First of all, I used 2 equalizers to clean up the spectrum. With the first one I got rid of some nasty whistling around 4 kHz together with subtle reduction of high-end fizz. And second EQ is for problem zones on mids which sounded bit like a phone.
Изальда Сделай шаг изо льда Твои слова Сделай шаг изо льда Твои слова Сделай шаг.
Then I used Pro C in such a way that it mostly responds to loud parts. It's pretty easy to get if you look at the waveform, it's not very consistent. Good example is this transition from clean to extreme vocals. And now with the compressor.
Не сломлен я! Не сломлен! Не сломлен я!
Now it sounds much more linear. After that I use some minor de-essing to get basic control on sibilants.
Не сломлен я! Не сломлен! Не сломлен я!
And pretty big amount of saturation of NLS and mic mode to bring back some life.
Не сломлен я! Не сломлен! Не сломлен я! Изо льда твои слова. Сделай шаг, не робей. Не сломлен я! Не сломлен!
And that's it. Right after I did export for each of 4 doubles from dedicated bus, only moved positions of locators using that command key I mentioned before. Then I did the same thing for 4 single tracks straight from dedicated channel. Now we're moving to master project where I have all pre-processed instrumental stems along with the vocals. As mentioned previously, we're about to mix vocals on top of instrumental master, so for this purpose I did route old master to a new bus. We're gonna have our old limiter here instead of old master, so basically it will be final destination for both instrumental master and vocals. That's where its name comes from. At this point I did some minor adjustments to the instrumental, but we'll leave it for later, because the point of this part is the actual integration of our vocals to the mix. So I put 4 doubles in the project, and because there was a lot of empty space inside of them, I was able to insert single tracks there as well. All 4 have been routed to vocals bus, and that one then goes straight to limiter bus. I started to polish the tracks with EQ, cutting off stuff I didn't like and then using channels level controller to fine-tune the volume. Because of that each time I did some cuts and compensated the volume, another problem zones started to become more obvious. I didn't have any idea of how it should sound though, so I basically continued to cut stuff over and over, compensating the level again and again until I was happy with sounding. Unfortunately all those little level adjustments have been lost, and because of such a great amount of spectrum reductions vocals may become too loud if I do partial or complete bypass of modules. So please keep that in mind and try to focus on spectrum changes. At some point you might feel that vocals are too low in volume though, try to ignore that just for now, it will be more open when it comes to next part of the video. Somewhere in between of those cuts I decided to try some compression. So first of all I used T-Rax bus compressor. It works pretty deep and aggressive, raising the overall density of vocals, unlike previously used Pro C which only did reduction of loud parts. In addition to that I used multiband compressor as additional controller of sibilants on higher band, but since I was there I also tried to apply some compression to other bands in order to make vocals even more stable and linear.
Сделай шаг изо льда. Твои слова. Сделай шаг изо льда.
At this point I pretty much ran out of free inserts on channel, so I've continued my EQ madness on bus, only this time I actually did use gain compensation. In addition, I used dynamic EQ to do surgical reduction of one particular unstable zone around 5 kHz, which appears to be a problem at some random parts of the arrangement. And so last thing I wanted to do was connection of dynamics between instrumental and vocals. For this purpose I used Pro C in sidechain mode, driven by kick and snare. Now vocals sounds good, however it's still pretty dry, so it's time to bring up some space processing. Unlike our main vocals, those will go to instrumental master to have better correlation of vocals with the actual mix. So in this case dynamics gluing will be done by master compressor. Instead of sending signal from vocals bus I'm gonna do it from the actual channel, as it remains unaffected by sidechain Pro C. Main part of our space is going to be reverb. I would usually go for room or vintage reverbs from Valhalla, but this time I decided to try Ubermod. It turns out that it has pretty damn good presets for reverberation, so I tried one of them. And I only did some equalization together with enhancement of stereo width to get better sounding.
Твои слова. Сделай шаг.
Pretty much the same story goes for delay, only this time I used different preset with pretty simple EQ on top.
Изо льда. Сделай шаг изо льда. Твои слова.
Then I applied same routing and processing to other 3 channels. With that majority of our vocals sounded pretty good, however not without flaws. Main problem was inability to do region automation of audio because of compressors we've used. Any attempts to operate the levels would also change behavior of compressors, messing up the tone. I'm not even saying that it wasn't very effective as compressors will try to apprise or reduce the level to the point we've set. For this reason parts with overlapping vocals sounded like a mess. For same reason I couldn't do smooth transitions between different channels. Just listen to some examples of that. Another problem is inability to independently operate the balance between dry vocals and space. That's why I decided to print process stems again, only this time we'll do separate export for every channel. So I'm going to mute all the vocals except for let's say Vox 1 and do batch export from 2 space tracks and Vox bus. This way we can have fully processed dry sounding together with separated space for current channel. And so then I'll go for other channels same way until I have complete pack. In addition to all that, I decided to print outcome of every channel in order to have uncompressed signal, which can be used for sidechain reduction of guitars. You'll see that later. So by the end of the day we'll get 4 packs of stems, 4 tracks in total on each. However, I didn't like the sound of whispering part. It seemed like the tone wasn't really good plus space was too boring, so I decided to do custom processing for it. Same as other tracks, we'll route it to vocals bus, only this time we're not gonna use sends to space. So right off the bat I started to build some really nice space. It's made out of default sounding of Valhalla Room and 2 delays with some tone correction in between. And so when that was done I did additional export of whispering from vocals bus. Alright, so all our process stems are uploaded back to the same project. Main part of our arrangement is represented by 4 sets of stems with dry vocals and 2 additional space channels for each. Still I did separate some parts out of that because I wanted them to be processed in a different way. Main 4 sets however are processed in a same way, so dry vocals of say second set will have exact same settings as others, same goes for delays and reverbs. The reason behind that is that I wanted to avoid overlapping on single channel in order to do really good transitions. So right after I found proper settings, I did a lot of editing so everything sounds nice and continuous. In this case I was mostly operating with fades and region level automations. Nice example of that may be found around 26 bar where we have overlapping vocals. As soon as other channel kicks in, this one will get 4 decibels level drop, sort of giving the road to another and then smoothly fade out. Speaking of processing, I did use all the available inserts for main channels. Still it wasn't enough so I used to create vocals bus in order to complete the processing. So our main channels are routed to vocals bus and that bus then goes straight to limiter. And all the space is going to instrumental master for same old reasons. So when it comes to main vocals, I did use a lot of subtle surgical steps in order to fine-tune spectral placement of vocals in the mix. For the most part it's gonna be whistles or resonances above 2 kHz, but still I did some cuts on lower regions as well. On top of that, I used Uber mode to get subtle spread of vocals in stereo.
И мой ответ готов жить, но без закона. Да, сжаты кулаки, я готов идти напролом.
Subtle saturation of Oxford inflator will help our vocals to cut through the mix better.
Сквозь терни всех преград, я не жалкий раб. Я делаю удар, превращая в дар свою злость, и мой ответ готов.
I also used a major in order to fine-tune stereo image of our vocals. Even though it may look extreme when it comes to numbers, the overall effect remains subtle because of small amount of side information. Previously I've had a lot of problems between 7 and 10 kHz, so I decided to play safe and get rid of side information for that zone completely, getting pretty interesting stereo spread as a result.
Как изо льда твои слова летят в меня. Сделай шаг и не робей, если надо, бей сильней.
Last thing I did for main vocals is additional side chain compressor. Same as previous one, it's driven by kick and snare, only this time we use multipin module. In this case I chose to go for 2 zones which seem to jump on top of instrumental.
Сломай меня, сломай меня. Как изо льда твои слова летят в меня.
And so with subtle pumping from rhythm section I was able to get really strong correlation between vocals and other instruments, like we didn't use master separation at all.
Сделай шаг и не робей, если надо, бей сильней. Сломай меня, шаг и не робей, если надо, бей сильней. Сломай меня,
Correction of delay is extremely subtle. I only cut some muddy lows around 200 Hz to avoid negative impact on master compressor.
Сделай шаг и не робей, если надо, бей сильней. Сломай меня. Если надо, бей сильней. Сломай меня.
And for reverb I cut 2 resonances around 3 kHz.
Сделай шаг и не робей. Не робей, если надо, бей сильней. Сломай меня. Сделай шаг и не робей, если надо, бей сильней. Сломай меня.
And that's how main part of arrangement works. However, there were 2 sections which cried for different way of processing. First of them is this vocal part with speech on top.
Порви меня слабого, сбрось со скалы с ликующей радостью. Ногой прощай и до свидания, чтобы упасть мне хватит касания.
For some reason it turned out to be a little dirty, like it was recorded with a different mic or different room. So for this part I used different equalization in order to get rid of all the dirtiness.
В клочья порви меня слабого, сбрось со скалы с ликующей радостью. Ногой прощай и до свидания, чтобы упасть мне хватит касания. В клочья порви меня слабого, сбрось со скалы с ликующей радостью. Ногой прощай и до...
On top of that I use subtle amount of slap delay or whatever settings of Uber mod Elvis Presley used, ending up with some sort of roomy feeling.
До свидания, чтобы упасть мне хватит касания. Клочья порви меня, слабого сбрось со скалы, с ликующей радостью ногой прощай. И до свидания, чтобы упасть мне хватит касания. Клочья порви меня, слабого сбрось со скалы, с ликующей радостью ногой прощай.
Speech overlay is separated to two channels with same processing. The only difference is that one of them panned to the right and another one to the left. I didn't want to mess up main vocal line of this section, so I decided to give those overlays some sort of lo-fi phone sounding with EQ. And I also used pretty big room to move it to the background.
Порви меня слабого, сбрось со скалы, с ликующей радостью. В клочья порви меня слабого, сбрось со скалы, с ликующей радостью ногой прощай. Порви меня слабого, сбрось со скалы, с ликующей радостью ногой прощай. Порви меня слабого, сбрось со скалы, с ликующей радостью ногой прощай. И до свидания, чтобы упасть не хватит касания.
Second set of custom vocals is going to be that mixture of whispering and soft singing. I only used additional stereo enhancement to further emphasize space feeling. And I didn't use any processing for singing whatsoever. The only thing I did was dry vocals attenuation together with long fade-in. That allowed me to get really beautiful sounding together with great transition from whispering to singing. Just listen. Sounds great. So at this point our vocals are finished, but we still can add some extra stuff here and there. So I took final part of whispering, processed it with reverb and printed results. Then I just placed that thing across the track to get additional sonic emphasis where I wanted. On top of that I used inverted variations to get some nice and long uprisings. And I also used additional reverb for vocals outro so it fades out really nice. In order to make this audition transparent, I used automated EQ on main vocals channel to get rid of unwanted fizz on highs. Without it, fade out didn't feel smooth enough. And that's it for vocals. It's time to show you those little adjustments on instrumental. As you remember, we did use some compression and tone correction on our mix. That might be one of the reasons why I wanted to adjust some things in front of master. Or maybe I just let my ears to refresh and notice few things I'd wanted to change. I didn't really do anything for that big spacey bass part as I was happy with it. However, when it comes to main bass part, I did cut one resonance around 5 kHz with standard EQ, and 2 more resonances around the same zone with dynamic 1, because some whistling seemed to be unstable, so dynamic cuts turned out to be a good solution. As you can see, I separated the stem into 2 parts. One of them is for purely instrumental parts, while another one is for parts with vocals on top. So for second channel I use little more cuts above 1 kHz in order to avoid frequency conflicts. Also got rid of first dynamic EQ.
Зажав в себе, прячу мысли от людей, как изо льда. Твои слова,
When it comes to clean guitar, I did pretty huge interruption in the tone for both channels. On top of that, I used 50% stereo enhancement for wet parts so it sounds little whiter. Then grouped them under a bus to apply some more EQ. In general, it allowed me to get pretty transparent and clean tone in the mix. I also did some polishing for rhythm guitars.
Ночь меняет день, не моя тень, растворится в
Now the interesting part. Remember I told you that we're about to have pretty complex dynamics relations between the instrumental and vocals? That's why we'll need those sidechain renders. All of them are routed to this compressor. Most of the energy of our vocals comes from mono, so I set up compressor in such a way that it will only compress center of stereo, leaving side untouched. It means that the compression will be transparent, but still very effective.
Если надо, бей сильней, сломай меня. Айша, не робей.
Previously we did same kind of thing from one part of the mix to vocals, and now vocals will force the mix to change as well, so dynamics relations have become two-sided. Originally our rhythm should have that little fade and uprising in the beginning, but I didn't like how it sounds, and in order to recreate that I used other version of the same chord from here, reversed the audio, soloed the right side to make sound come from center, and then applied some dynamic equalization to reduce unstable low-end resonances. It shouldn't be there, but I also used same part right in front of final section of the song just because I like it. Some EQ for lead guitar as well, just little correction of whistles. And when it comes to drums, I mostly did a lot of surgical cuts for overheads, room, and then for both of them under related bus. After all these cuts, I've noticed some whistling on snare located around 5 kHz. And last adjustment I did was track for noise, generated by Uber mod. I used EQ to make it little smoother. And also some automation so it won't be obvious on start and finish of the song. We're almost done now, so it's time to export the track and proceed with final step. The only thing left to do is properly cut the track, apply fades and set the export markers. Still, I did some subtle region level automation to bring more contrast to the song. It's okay to do it on top of fully mastered track because we only bring the levels down, so peaks are all safe. This way I can manipulate the levels and keep proper dynamics formed by limiter. So before we'll go for final demonstration, just let me remind that you can get it on Bandcamp in original quality for a low price and give some support to the band. Thanks for watching.